Autumn for Barbarossa Deluxe Edition. The game was originally published in a magazine, I believe, but now we have the Deluxe Edition. And you know the Deluxe means something different in wargaming when you realize that a Deluxe game doesn't come with a box. Doesn't even come with a Ziploc bag like you have for a word game, like a folio game or a magazine game. Nope, it came with these two sheets of cardboard with the map and the counters and the rulebook all like wrapped together in a film that you had to tear apart to open the game. So there's just no storage system that comes with the game in the deluxe version. Also weird in terms of production, the map is not any larger or particular or much larger than other games, the other word games that come with paper maps, especially thinking about the standards of MMP, so the same publisher of this one, but they did split it in two, which makes it a little more annoying. You'll need a piece of plexiglass. I guess they assume that by now every word gamer has a piece of plexiglass, but still. A bit unusual when you think about a deluxe edition of anything. Other than that, the production is pretty much what you expect from other MMP games in terms of, say, the counters. Simple, classic kind of counters, just the kind of thickness, quality of coded counters that you expect from MMP. And since we're here, of course, this is a game in the standard combat system, so it's an introductory level system, excellent for newer gamers, and so you just have all the information that you need and not much else. You have attack value, defense value, movement value. If these values are inside a yellow box, the unit is capable of exploitation movement, that is, they get to move and possibly overrun attack during the exploitation phase, but that's the general idea. So Autumn for Barbarossa takes place in the late summer of 1941. We are at the end of the opening phase of Barbarossa. The Germans are coming this way, and they have a nice number of units, especially exploitation-capable units at the beginning of the game. The Soviets are defending, especially around here. Smolensk, of course, is a very prized location, and so the Germans will try to push as much as possible and acquire as much advantage as possible, especially early on. Because around turn 6, there is a random check. And so at some point between turn 6 and turn 8, there will be a major withdrawal of exploitation-capable units from the German side. By then, the Soviets will have brought a lot of reinforcements in. Some of these will have spent a lot of time just making their way through the board and reaching the area of the confrontation. So the Germans are pushing the front, the Soviets are bringing in reinforcements, and at some point, again, between turn 6 and 8, which can be a big swing, that's huge difference here, the Germans find themselves massively reduced. You remove all of your exploitation-capable units from the board, you bring back a much smaller number, and that's it, because those units have been diverted from this section of the front, and that's when the Soviets can start pushing back, try to surround and seal and trap German units in pockets so they get stuck without supplies. It gets bad. So the Germans really need to gain some massive advantage early on. And that's important because position is what matters, because we are fighting here for victory points based on control of locations on the board. Again, the game is in the standard combat system. I'm gonna put some like kind of random units there on the board just because it's fun that way. So like other games in the standard combat system, the idea is move. You have player 1 activates and has a movement phase. Then that player can also attack and launch attacks. And then there's an exploitation phase in which again only exploitation-capable units, the one with the yellow box around their factors, only those units will get to activate in the exploitation phase. There you go. So that's kind of fun. And so, first movement phase, it's what you expect it to be. Units on the active side can move up to the full movement allowance as modified by terrain. You're gonna be really road bound here, especially the German player. Heck, it's so much so that the two sides even have different amounts, different expenditures of movement points. You have two different terrain effects tables to account for, say, how differently they handle the swamps. And so the Germans really need to exploit the roads as much as possible. And you'll see the Soviets hanging out in the swamps a lot because it gives you also nice defensive combat. So movement, move units up to the full movement allowance as much as possible using roads. So enemies also control will slow you down, but if you have units with massive amount of movement points, they may be able to move through multiple zones of control. Once movement has been resolved, then you can declare attacks. You can pile up multiple attackers against the same enemy. Very classic. You total all of the attack points and attack factors of the attacker, divide by the defending factor of the defender or defenders. See, there is a stack in there. Turn that into a ratio. Apply modifiers based on terrain, which may be shifting of the columns. It may be that maybe the attacker got their attack strength halved if they were attacking across a river, for example. Once you have your right column, roll 2 dice, cross-reference the column with the result of the die roll, and you apply the results in the form of step losses for the defender and retreats, step losses for the attacker, step losses and retreats for the attacker. I don't remember if there is any. No, I don't see any retreat for the attacker, but it should be. I seem to remember retreating at some point. Anywho, very simple. Attacking or defend. You can convert some of your retreats in the step losses if you really want to retain control of a location. And there are, of course, penalties for, say, retreating into enemy zones of control. But that's the general idea. You also have, again, after that is resolved, you have the exploitation phase in which exploit units with yellow movement blocks, they may get to activate. Hey, you forgot about me. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, boom, and there I am. You also have overrun, which is a kind of combat that may take place as part of movement by spending movement points. A couple of other things. The two sides have airstrikes, so they have tokens they can spend to launch airstrikes. The number varies, and again, that tells you about the changing tide of the battle, because if you are early on, the German player has a lot of those, 2d6 airstrikes, for example, in the first couple of turns, and the Soviet player has none. Later on, they get more airstrikes. You roll dice, and there is a good chance that the enemy will be at least disorganized, which, of course, will reduce their capabilities. They may also simply lose steps. So you also, once you disorganize a unit or stack, then for each unit in that stack, you also roll a die to see if they also lose steps. So that's particularly important to soften up Soviets that are in good defensive positions, especially exploiting terrain. So you soften them up that way. You can also leave steps behind as you're retreating and leave garrisons behind. Again, particularly important if you are retreating, if you are the defender. And that's the general idea. Again, there aren't a lot of extra rules. This makes for this game. It's every game in the system is an introductory war game or introductory level war game. This one among them all is probably the most introductory of them all, because I think it's the one with possibly the fewest extra rules or new rules or special rules. There are no special rules, for example, for the Soviet player, no unique special rules. For the German, there's only the big retreat at some point. So what you have is an incredibly simple game, definitely an excellent introduction to wargaming, in case there's somebody who is still deciding whether they want to enter this side of the hobby or not. Excellent introduction to wargaming in general and to this system in particular. It does what a wargame should be doing, and at least, as I grow older, I'm appreciating simple war games more and more. Probably the exhaustion of the pandemic is part of this factor. But this is the kind of war game that I want to play more and more often when I'm playing war games. I'm having a harder and harder time committing to the kind of complicated war games I was playing in 2010 or 2012. Now, overall, on top of that, the fact that there's advantage that it's about the flow, it's about the action, you still do a lot of math, but very manageable. On top of that, the overall action is pretty interesting because both sides will be in the position of the attacker and the defender. It's sort of like a really mini Barbarossa, because the big strategic sweep of history that we know happened with the Germans pushing in depth and them being pushed back will happen here, but in the span of a single evening. You can play the game in a longish evening, or you break it down, of course. But the idea is still that you're gonna see the whole thing, the Germans making some gains and then being pushed back, which of course makes both sides interesting to play. Because as the Russian player, you're not gonna attack much early on. There's just not, you don't have the numbers. But if you just keep retreating gradually, exploiting yet the next river, retreat to yet the next swamp, there's no need for you to take a stand around here. So you'll be hopping back slowly, trying to reform your groups, trying to keep a lawn front so that you're not surrounded. Supply rules are important here. So, but of course, just hopping back and hiding behind the river is not as exciting, but you'll get to a point where the tide turns, and then even as the Soviet player, you'll get to do that, to be the attacker, and now it's the German who's trying to not lose too much ground. So this is important if you're playing two-player. Incidentally, that is not my case, because I played this game solitaire, two-handed, and I like it that way also. I still like, even when I'm playing both sides, that both sides have something interesting to do in different phases of the game. Now, something interesting and fairly unusual, even in games where there's going to be a tide, is not always this dramatic. This is really dramatic. And there's also another thing. Even when there's a tide, a tide turn, a turn of the tide, very often you still have an incentive in preserving some of your units. Here, not so much. As the German player, that almost all of your exploitation-capable units are gonna disappear, regardless of how many you have still on the board at the time when the big withdrawal happens. So you're really gonna be more careless, so to speak. There is a desperate sense of trying to gain as much ground as possible, and you don't really need to worry about saving your units that are doomed in game terms anyways. So there's a different flow from other games. The Germans feel a little more desperate and reckless than in other games, even on similar topics, even about Barbarossa. And that's interesting because, again, it just makes the pace or the flow of the overall action for the Germans a little different early on. We are really just launching these almost suicidal attacks because you're gonna go anywhere. There's no incentive in being cautious early on, and you do need, trust me, you do need some massive advantage to be able to still stand a chance when the big Soviet wave hits you. So, in general, Autumn for Barbarossa is a really enjoyable war game. It's at the level of complexity that I can personally digest and enjoy these days. So it's perfect for me, but also a great game for new war gamers. And I think there's still enough interesting choices between terrain and the flow of the game. It's definitely a perfectly viable game, I believe in, for seasoned war gamers. That's why I should call it more an introductory level war game than an introductory war game. It's a perfectly legit war game, even if you have been playing war games for decades. This is still interesting challenges, interesting decisions, and nice flow, and also a nice overall interesting narrative arc with this action in which the overall strategic initiative changes so dramatically. And this is my assessment for autumn for Barbarossa.